Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. Make sure to take a moment and, most importantly, share this conversation. Put it in your social media. Send an email, a carrier pigeon, whatever it is, to folks to let us know that we're having this discussion. It's good to be with you all, as always. Make sure to do the basic things and like the video. Subscribe to the channel if you have not already. Support us on Patreon or buy me a coffee. Yeah, all of the things. It's good to be with you. Today is the 19th conversation, which I think aligns with how many months of genocide that we're in, with Abdaljawad Omar, who is a writer, analyst, and lecturer based in Ramallah, Palestine. He has extensively written in Arabic and English. He's contributed to Electronic Intifada, Ebb Magazine, Material, Mondo Weiss, and Rusted Radishes, among other outlets. We're today going to talk about a piece that he just published last week in Mondo Weiss. Shout out to them as a publication and all the work that they do. The piece is called Extermination as Negotiation, Understanding Israel's Strategy in Gaza. Aboud, welcome back to the show. It's good to be with you. Looking forward to discussing this with you today.
Thanks, Jared. Glad to be with you once again.
Right on. So I think we're primarily going to go through this piece today. We're going to have a little bit of a couple other things that we'll cover at the end. But I thought this was, an important piece. Kind of thinking about this state we've been in for a while in this war of, discussions of negotiations, acceptance of proposals or frameworks by Hamas, and then Israel denying them or walking away from them or changing the terms. And you kind of put these into a couple of different camps. You're looking at the sort of framework where international groups would come in and administer Gaza in a kind of depoliticized state where Palestinians wouldn't have any form of sort of political subjectivity, but would be, administered aid and so on. And then I think on the other end is sort of the annihilationists, exterminationists plan that we see Israel, moving forward with all the time, with, taking up more land, destroying more of the infrastructure of Gaza, and starving people to death, really. So I don't want to put more words in your mouth than that, but maybe just start a little bit by the kind of overall framework that you were looking at here and how you were looking to see these different, these different tendencies, which I think you see as in, coordination or collaboration with each other in certain ways.
Thanks, Jared. I mean, it's so since the outset of this particular war, I've been going against the grain, not trying to, romanticize me going against the grain in anything that it's not that significant. But I think that much of, for example, Palestinian Arab discourse around Israeli military planning, if you want, and conduct of war usually tends to almost overinflate the extent to which Israelis, in fact, have everything laid out as a rationalist, utilitarian, efficient form of ends and means logic, where one form of technique, tactic, is joined with operations and then joined with military strategy that actually achieves a specific end game. And I think for people who have been watching me here, generally speaking, I'm very skeptical about that. Like, not because I think it does not have any truth, it has a lot of truth, but my problem with it is that it tells me more about the ways we analyze Israel rather than what Israel actually does or doesn't do or thinks or doesn't think. as a political actor, if we're going to assume that it's a homogeneous, uh, uh, political or military actor. So there's one element to that that to me has very little, correspondence to reality. Always, like there's always an inflation of colonial mastery, if you want, and that is quite problematic because Israel also in its psychic, if you want, assault, but also information warfare tends to also overinflate its own successes. I mean, just to take an example, for instance, it attributes the fall of the Assad regime to itself, which is not really the case. I mean, it's part of an intricate alliance system, imperial intervention, local insurgent groups that coalesced, and of course there is some sort of strategic shift that happens as a result of the war, specifically the weakness or the weakening backers of the regime itself, weakening of the backing of the regime from Hezbollah and others. But it's not an Israeli pure success, but Israel tends to attribute these successes to itself, because what it wants to really do is always flaunt its ability to launch wars, to be successful at them, as an own self-referential narrative, but also as a narrative that it exports to the imperial core to attest to its own efficacy and the need for and its necessity for, if you want, imperial planning more broadly, specifically in the region that we live in. So there's one element that speaks to that in the piece, where that is less the case. I mean, or I try as much as possible to make it less the case. And even in our discussion last time, that was also similar, that we should also read Israel through different lenses, not only through this kind of highly deliberative, rationalist, ends to means logic that usually Arab intellectuals and a lot of Arab analysts give it much more credence than it is. Specifically, if we actually look at Israeli military discourse, it's full of how tactics open space for political possibility rather than being tethered to a specific political possibility per se in each encounter with resistance or otherwise. So meaning that Israelis themselves decry their own sense of relationship to strategy, where they think they lack one, and they tend to actually see themselves more tethered to notions of the primacy of tactics and operations as a means to garner and achieve whatever notion of victory that they can at a specific historical moment. Having said that, I mean, in terms of at least the military discourse, Israel does have another tendency, which is the attempt, of course, for temporal management, the management cannibalization of time, the ability to produce through negotiations also a different instrument of war, which I broach through the piece as one of interrogation. No, and I mean by the Shin Bet interrogation, where Palestinian prisoners are arrested and confined, and also undergo techniques and tactics of interrogation that combine the physical with the intimate and the relational with the psychic all at once, and of course with a lot of different tricks that are also part and parcel of these techniques to try and extract what I call a moment of collapse in the Palestinian prisoner experience, specifically in the encounter between Palestinian prisoners and their interrogators. So I mean, these are like 2 points of, if you want, of entryways to what I tried to write, and trying to connect them together, because I think what is important now is that as we look at this war and its machinery of violence, its daily massacres, that whenever people speak of these kind of grandiose plans like the Egyptian peace proposal or Israeli guardian chariots, I think, plan to conquer Gaza, demographically sterilize it, and create these wholesale kill zones and concentrate the population and eventually remove the population from the Gaza Strip as they envision. What is problematic is that we don't see this really unfolding underground as the plan proclaims. No, what we're seeing is still massacres, still the entry of the army, attempts to concentrate, attempts to lure people into specific zones and make them, but it's still not full on, as if like somebody's, hesitating, or somebody's actually in this midway between these two plans, navigating them. On the one hand, trying to ensure that international support for the machinery of massacres that are happening in Gaza continues, while at the same time also flirting with the possibility of ethnically cleansing Gaza and clearing the Palestinians from Palestine, and at the same time keeping the war rolling on in the hopes of inducing that moment of collapse. So this is what really the piece is about. And what I try to do as much as possible, Jared, is like connected to how this kind of strategy is actually quite similar to the Palestinian prisoner experience, specifically in the interrogation, into the interrogation. Yeah.
Yeah, and I have a few different points of it that I actually kind of highlighted that I want to talk about, and so we'll get to that, the interrogation room and so on. But one of the quotes that I wanted to read back to you is this is from the piece. In this way, Israel is not simply fighting Hamas, it is managing the time of collapse of Gaza's infrastructure, of regional diplomacy, and its own internal contradictions. The so-called plans, in quotes, it circulates, are not blueprints for action, but instruments of disorientation. By alternating between military escalation and diplomatic non-engagement, Israel traps adversaries and allies alike in a theater of endless anticipation. And I just felt like that paragraph really encapsulated that now, and look, my stakes in this are not personal, right? Like, but every time I see, some note about a ceasefire, right? Like, there's a part of me that gets a little bit of hope, but there's more of me that says, you know, for folks who bet, like, what is the over under on how long until Israel like disavows this, or says that Hamas is obstructing a deal, or whatever, like, meaning that we've seen this for different versions of it for 19 months, but especially in recent months where it seems like perhaps there's some sort of potential breakthrough in negotiations, and yet, like, this, you're left in this state of this anticipation, and I can't imagine how excruciating that is for people in Gaza, right? I mean, for Palestinians in general, but for particularly for people who are just like, desiring an end to the massacres and the aid schemes as they're starving and stuff, and as their children and their elders needing medicine, all of this, right? And you always get reports or see people on social media of sort of the excitement that starts to pulse through Gaza at this news that is really not news yet, because it's not a deal. It's just, Israel is playing this kind of game. And as you're talking in the piece too, you talk about that, going, I guess, into the interrogation room. You talk also about how the negotiator for the prisoner becomes the only person that they have contact with, and so the negotiation becomes something that that you participate in, but there's a real psychological warfare kind of element to it. So I don't want to say more in terms of my reactions to that, but yeah, I don't know if you want to say any more about that feeling and what you're getting at in the piece there.
Well, I mean, look, with one of the most complicated, I wouldn't say complicated, but one of the most, let's say, important elements of Israeli colonial strategy, specifically its power to discipline Palestinians, lies in the incarceration system. And the system has been in place since 1967, even when, some would go back to the 70s and speak of this kind of liberal occupation that existed then, that was like, centered around forms of biopower and, trying to like enhance Palestinian agriculture and planting trees. So there was this kind of like period where people speak of kind of an enlightened form of military occupation. Of course, I wouldn't, place it on these terms. Much of also these policies hit, a double bind. Even in that period, the most brutal, encounters with Israeli brute, cruel power was the prisons. And since 1967, we're talking about 1 million Palestinians that were actually incarcerated. These million Palestinians are mostly men, of course. So there's a third of all Palestinian men who were one way or another placed in prison, detained, or interrogated with. So interrogation is not only this kind of highly, individualized, let's say, experience for Palestinians. It's a collective one on one level. It doesn't include all Palestinians, but all Palestinians are in one way or another affected by it and impacted by it, because it does change people. It shatters their sense of self at times, boosts them sometimes. It has different elements to something akin to like a rite of passage type experience, if you want to now integrate some sort of anthropological reading. But it's not really a rite of passage that we voluntarily participate in, at least in any significant way. So this kind of incarceration, this system, this power of arrest, the power to decide who to arrest and who not to arrest, are all deeply, embedded in the ways Palestinians also self-discipline, self-govern themselves, self-surveil, and a lot of these elements that go into it. But the interrogation itself is complicated. Like, you're extracted from your normal life. It starts from the first moment you encounter an Israeli military officer that captures you. In that extraction, you're taking away generally at around twilight, around the morning hours, where people are sleeping. You're disoriented. You're taking into these dungeons in Jerusalem or other places where you don't see light really. You're separated from your whole social world suddenly, and then the whole agony of interrogation starts, where the interrogators control every aspect of your life, and there's nothing really in the interrogation that is a coincidence. It's all like designed in various ways to get you to capitulate, whether it's the friendly interrogator or the harsh, cruel one, or its elements of surprise, or elements of bringing intimate friends or family members to the interrogation room, and also arresting them and then releasing them, or whatever video you actually shown or news items you're actually shown. Everything is basically designed and created in a way where this kind of controlled environment sets you up to both a psychic confrontation, but also a physical confrontation, including actual physical torture, which includes beatings and placing people in pressure positions, and other forms of physical torture that are also part and parcel of this interrogation process. But when you're isolated and you're taken away, one of the things that people speak about is that you start to yearn for just somebody to recognize that you exist. Like, if you're left for days in a highly confined room with very little space, no light in it, full of cockroaches and dirt, and with very minimal food, because also in interrogation you're placed under hunger conditions, but still given enough to sustain yourself so you can actually speak whatever the interrogators want you to say or want to extract from you. So there is these elements of sustaining the prisoner, but at the same time ensuring that they're in conditions that make everything about their experience highly vulnerable. You feel the sense of power of the interrogators themselves in defining the outlines of your day, what you do, what you don't do, how many hours you sleep, how many hours you don't sleep. So this entire physical, spatial confinement, elements of how much food you eat, cleanliness, all the way towards, uh, uh, creating conditions, if you want, that makes you more susceptible to the Israeli interlocutor who speaks Arabic, and at least recognizes that you exist. So like at some point where you're confined and left, this is for many prisoners a quite horrific moment. If you're left 12, 13, 15, sometimes more than that, alone with nobody to speak to, nobody to interact with, and minimal food, again, confined space, nothing to do. So in these elements, I mean, we can see this kind of relationship with Gaza of how it's, of course, it's always hard to make this kind of jump from an individual prisoner's experience to one where the conditions is actually massacres. But you see this kind of deliberate control of aid and the trickling of aid, for instance, in the Gaza Strip. So hunger conditions. You see elements of massacring every day, so showing you and displaying that the violence and its ability to take away loved ones, friends, family members, and it places you under this duress of uncertainty where you could be killed at any moment, because there's also no logic that you can really extricate from Israel's policy in the Gaza Strip, or on who it kills and who doesn't kill, because it's basically killing everybody and anybody. The fourth element is that it's also creating conditions of collaboration from within Gaza society. One of the techniques that Israeli advanced actually in the interrogation of Palestinian prisoners is what we call asafir. Asafir are birds, to translate into English, and they're actually Palestinians or Arabs who speak Arabic, and where you're placed in this kind of false cell, but they're all collaborators with the Israeli interrogators. And basically what happens then is that you think you've reached the prison where it's the actual political prisoner movement is, but there's all these deliberate, if you want, plans and schemes through which these asafir, these birds, basically also enable you or facilitate your confession either with them or with the interrogator later on. So, funny enough, it was actually devised by a Palestinian, this technique. It wasn't an Israeli invention. But anyways, that's a different story for a different history. But the only thing that here is important is that this kind of highly controlled environment, this very highly studied psychological, physical, spatial, temporal manipulation / also elements of collaboration. This is all part of, let's say, the story of Gaza since the 7th of October. And what I always contend is that the confession is not only about information. That's one of elements that also should be clear, I think, or is not very clear even in Palestinian discourse around the interrogation room. It's also about the collapse of the prisoner, the confessing or the confession act as an act of surrender, as one that actually induces acknowledgement on the interrogator as somebody who succeeded in the manipulation of space, time, all of these different elements that include psychological, physical techniques, etc. So basically what I'm here trying to juxtapose is that in a similar fashion, this is what Israel is really looking for. It's this kind of total moral, social disintegration in Gaza, an attempt to create from Gaza a situation where not only people stop discussing, for instance, Hamas and resistance and Palestine, not only are they like, well versed in the idea of survival, and the grammar of survival, with its painstaking ability to actually also extricate you from relationships and responsibilities towards community and others, because you start to think about your own family and individuated sense of self as a means to survive or immigrate or leave Gaza, or all of these different elements that people speak to, which are also true. But I think it's primarily seeking this kind of collapse. Well, first of all, the confession of regret on whatever happened on October 7th. Second of all, a collapse where the Palestinian society is incapable of resurrecting itself once again. And third and foremost is for immigration out of Gaza to, in fact, become something of a voluntary idea. Of course, it's still forced, but a voluntary idea that people slowly but steadily acquiesce to. So I think these are elements that are embedded in this element, and I think that part of the interrogation room technique is basically extricated and placed on a full-scale sense, but of course with the use of massacre firepower. And but it's the same thing. It's the total control of space and time, or I wouldn't say total control, but control of space and time, control of manipulating factors around hunger and basic survival needs, and of course trying to pit also Palestinians against each other in an effort and in the hope that will induce enough social disintegration and political infighting that people will come out of this war not only tired but also in a state of collapse that is irreversible.
Yeah, thank you. So another section, you're talking here about the different plans, back to what we were talking about a little earlier of the different, Israeli plans, right? And so you write, these plans become not resolutions, but literal traps. They embolden some, humiliate others, and erode the coherence of any alternative vision. But Israel remains within the suspended terrain of both plans. And you can just remind folks what the two plans are, but you kind of say it here. On the one hand, it seeks to retrieve its prisoners before completely wiping out Gaza. On the other, it aims to appease the Arab governments that have remained silent, have not severed their ties with Israel, and have gradually, though assuredly, offered an alternative to genocide through a politics of sterilization. Not to mention the prospect of completely undoing the people of Gaza remains alive, serving Netanyahu's own management of his coalition and his desire to emerge as a historic leader who decisively ended the Palestinian question or the Palestine question. So there's a lot that you're like kind of talking about in that paragraph. I think one of the things that stood out to me was just these Arab governments, right? Who I think that if there was anyone who thought that anything was going to come from them, that visit that Trump recently did to the Middle East, you thought maybe they'll pressure him in some way around something. And there was instead just no mention of Palestine. And of course, other folks have said, look, that they never do, that's not new. And I also saw other folks say, look, like if you want to look to solidarity with Palestinians, you have to look more to countries with a long history of anti-colonial tradition, not necessarily to these Arab regimes, which have been built off of really, being kind of client states for the West at this point, and Israel as a kind of junior partner in that. But nonetheless, you talk about this alternative that they pose of a politics of sterilization. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, and I guess on the other hand is just the contradictions that Netanyahu is still, kind of seeking to manage, as well as this point, which I think I agree with you on, that that a legacy piece for him is whether he can decisively end the Palestine question.
I mean, I don't think he will. Like it's not a, I think I don't think that that's what's gonna unfold. If you want a prediction of the future, but I think that because even in the worst case scenarios, the Palestine question will remain. But like so you have two plans. The two plans are basically they have elements of either neutralization or sterilization. No, so in the Egyptian plan, we get neutralization. Gaza becomes something like the West Bank. A pliable, governable, administrated by the Palestinian Authority or some other forum, does not really contain any form of resistance that is active in the long term or can become a headache or a nuisance to Israel or strategically defy it, as we saw on October 7th. So, in essence, with the Egyptian proposal, you get something alongside of what's going on or has been going on in the West Bank for the past 19 years. It will end the massacres. Perhaps we won't see wide-scale ethnic cleansing, although ethnic cleansing already kind of also unfolded. There's still a lot of Palestinians caught outside of Gaza. Nobody really knows if and when they will return, if that happens at any point, how many people will leave, specifically if there's any end of the war, and some sort of openness to for people from Gaza to leave Gaza. We will see about that, what happens and unfolds around that. But in essence, that's the Egyptian vision, a reconstruction, end of the war, but on the cost of neutralization. So it's one element, and it's an element that Israel's center right and center left elites, I would say, not the society, because it seems to me that most of the Israeli society seeks and desires simply for Palestinians to disappear. But at least as would reckon with that, because they would see it. This is a strategic success. We've neutralized the Gaza front. At the same time, we've weakened Hezbollah. Syria, we have a changed geostrategic position, and Israel is in a better position, just more broadly, if it comes with the war, even with Gaza still remaining, a Gaza and an Egyptian peace proposal being placed front and center. So that's one vision. And again, this is also a vision that serves Arab countries, because on the one hand, it maintains Palestinians in Palestine. It sustains a relationship of normalization and in the need for security coordination between Arab countries and Israel and the US. It still places Israel in this kind of dependency on regional actors, specifically through diplomacy like Qatar and Egypt. And it still creates, room and space for maneuvering where Palestinians are not, cleansed from the land. Therefore, the next frontiers, if you want, in the futurity of such a struggle will become now more Arab Israeli rather than Palestinian Israeli once again, Because with these messianic settlers, neither Gaza nor the West Bank is the ultimate end of their settler enterprise. Eventually, if they have the demographics in 100 years or whatever, they will move to other spaces. So for the Arabs, it solves the problem. Palestinians remain in Palestine, neutralized and incapable of really creating disruptive moments that will create any problems for any future plans to normalize and others. So it helps the Arabs, it helps Israel, and at the same time, it ensures still this kind of American hegemony in the region, but with still the Palestinian question not really resolved, but at least not a big of a deal, could be managed some way or another. So that's one element of the Egyptian proposal as being advanced. And of course, for people now in Gaza, I mean, anything that stops the war is what people desire, and just an end to the massacres, an end to what's happening, and some sort of post-war vision that might see some sort of life come back. That's what people are looking for. So it aligns with that desire among the Palestinians in Gaza as well. The other vision is this kind of, right-wing Israeli messianic elements that are, pushing for a complete ethnic cleansing, not only of Gaza, but also the West Bank, and the continuation of perpetual war as a means to do so. The problem with that is that it's also hits across, Arab reticence and resistance at some point. And in here, I don't mean resistance in resistance as we speak about it in the Palestinian context, but a resistance because it harms some of the interests around Arab states, specifically states like Jordan and Egypt, but also some of the Gulf states as well that are, in a quite good relationship with Israel at this particular point. And any major ethnic cleansing campaign will also harm that even further, create headaches for them in multiple arenas. And at the same time, it's something that while they might contemplate and perhaps flirt with, something that is highly unpopular with their own societies and population, and also creates in the long term issues around regional stability as millions of Palestinians are, shattered once again, becoming diasporic communities and refugee communities in Arab states. And, as I said multiple times, historically, we have been people who create problems for these regimes. So there's all of these elements that are at play. And in this messianic kind of plan, Gaza sterilized. Israel both governs Gaza, but does not control the population, because either the population will be forced to leave or they'll be confined into space where still, they will not be governed by Israel specifically. So what is about that plan that is important is that it's basically a plan that not only excludes or, confines people to a specific area. It does that, but at the same time, it shows clearly the outlines of further concentration, sterilization, and eventually either killing or forcing these people to leave at some level. And I think this is the plan that Smotrich wants, the Big Gvir wants, but also as people who represent the collective unconscious of the Zionist movement more broadly, it's one that nobody in Israel, at least I'm not speaking about individuals, but nobody in Israeli political movements that really matter actually really objects to. Neither on moral or ethical grounds. Some might object on it on some strategic level because it might harm their relationships with some states and create problems for them, specifically in the future, legally, institutionally, with the world, contingent on the fact that people's movement in the world actually bring pressure to bear on their governments, but also on institutions that matter, including the ICG, ICC, and other forms of accountability that can be actually resurrected. So there's that level of desire. So some of the strategic, if you want, discussions in Israel and debates, hide the fact that Israel is not moving really into either this plan or the other plan. You don't stick 3 months, you don't declare plans of conquering Gaza while not really fulfilling them on the ground yet. You're still, in that space of in-betweenness. You declared, you leaked the idea of Libya, you leaked the idea of ethnically cleansing Palestinians to some country in Africa. You speak of these plans to sterilize, and we could say, yeah, this is a way to normalize, this type of plans and actions and make the world accept them, perhaps. But I think it's also quite significant is that on some level, that if you want this plan to move on, you'll just do it fast enough that nobody has a time to either to even object or place even some pressure on you to bear, if that pressure even exists. Or I doubt that exists from any country, at least significantly in the West specifically. So, I mean, there's an element to this kind of Israeli in-betweenness that we should understand, between these two plans. And I think that maneuvering space is also something symptomatic of Netanyahu's personality on the one hand. He's somebody that holds the card quite close to him, of course, narcissistic, with sense of, with of course, highly psychopathic tendencies. This is not my word, but the words of psychological profiles done on Netanyahu for a long time, and with the ability to easily lie, but also one who understands coalition politics in Israel, the need to maintain the coalition. And for that, he needs the war to continues, but also he can interplay on this level of in-betweenness without committing himself to either one of these plans, and at the same time keep his right-wing coalition happy, hopeful that the Messiah will emerge and solve all their problems from them at some point, or that the Palestinians in Gaza will simply be defeated and collapse and completely surrender to Israeli power, or that some sort of accomplishment can really be seen in Gaza in terms of resurrecting settlements and clearing people and all of that happening. So it keeps that promise and hope for this coalition partners. At the same time, he can still navigate the pressure coming from some elements within, the American administration / Arab countries, and try to negotiate with them and contest to what extent and what could be done with Gaza while by keeping the war open and trying their best to extract as much concessions as possible from the resistance movements, but at the same time, from regional players and international players as well, keen perhaps on ending the war at some close point from now. So this is how Israel is navigating itself, at least on this kind of strategic political plane. Because again, it doesn't make sense that if you want to ethnically cleanse people, that you wait that much for executing the plan. You should drive and mobilize your resources towards it, create the conditions for it, not only through these kind of daily calibrated, but at the same time, highly disorienting forms of massacres that are happening on a daily basis, but also in the way that you actually move in and clear. And of course, there's another element to why Israel is hesitant, because it also will pay some price doing that process. And it's a price that it's also trying to clear away, because it wants to mean the consensus around a perpetual war where it's not that pricey, at least on Israeli society, in terms of specifically people killed and injured, specifically soldiers in this context. So there's all of these elements, that they're trying to carry. And this is why I think when we speak of a strategic layout, or we speak of strategy here, we speak of a lot of these contradictions, whether they're internal to Israel, whether it's the personality of Netanyahu and his balancing act and his coalition, whether it's elements that to do with the military and what it can actually propose and create, whether it's also forms of psychological warfare and normalization of ethnic cleansing and genocide as a fact, whether it's also Israeli desire speaking more than Israeli actual end means type of thinking that is happening in highly calculative, highly utilitarian, and almost all-knowing, omnipresent, form of understanding of Israeli power, which I think is problematic. So I think that this is how we can speak of it. But based on that, based on how we can describe the scene, then the interrogation room comes up. Because this is where Israelis felt they're masters of space, time, the manipulation of space and time, inflicting physical injury, using tricks, negotiating with the subject and the object of the interrogation at the same time. So these are the elements that all go in, whether in the interrogation room, that can be, applied into the context of Gaza, where these elements also exist, and where, again, there is this kind of negotiating the time of collapse. And it doesn't really radically divorce itself, or let's say distance itself from the logic of negotiations, even in Oslo, because even in Oslo, Israel was manipulating time, but at time perhaps manipulating the idea of hope. In this context, the idea of hope of reaching for Palestinians a peaceful resolution, perhaps a state where Israeli soldiers don't have the right to come and arrest us. That's one element of why people in Palestine felt that some sort of state would at least safeguard them from these kind of brutal acts. And whether we speak of these kind of two-state solution frameworks from a structure or other perspectives, why at some point also in itself was not even that unpopular among Palestinians, because Palestinians want just to release from this kind of monstrous terror regime that they want to live in, or they're living under, to some sort of at least control over their space and time with less intervention, at least direct one from Israel, because even in the two-state solution, there will still be a lot of that indirect intervention. But they controlled, or they manipulated this time of hope. No, they manipulated this grammar of peace. The idea that Americans always blamed the Palestinians was already highly part and parcel of the function of American presidents, from Bill Clinton, even going back to Carter, if you want to later on changed his political rhetoric around Palestine quite significantly. But from the time of Carter till to today, that the Palestinians are the rejectionists, that the Palestinians miss an opportunity, never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity, that the Palestinians didn't, abdicate enough. That whole line, you see it today unfold so, brazenly and obscenely. And somebody like Stephen Witkoff or Biden and his, and his assistants, or perhaps his assistants were actually ruling the government, as we're now getting a privy to by Jake Tapper and others, no. But anyways, that basically they know Israel is lying, they know Israel is rejecting, they still blame the Palestinians, and do it with the ability to sleep at night, because they have never been really honest brokers. They are part and parcel of Israel negotiating tactics as well. And this is happening recursively. I mean, I think at least for people who want to be, I don't want to say, at least if you don't want to be stupid, you would see that, even if you're pro-Israel, you would understand that this is what's happening, that Hamas wants to end the war, it wants a ceasefire, that it wants to have a prisoner exchange deal, that Israel is the one rejecting these offers, that when Steve Witkoff or whoever it is negotiating and saying Hamas rejected or anything like that, it's all basically a bunch of lies that are, given out and spoken as if they're truths. So this is at least part of the picture in terms of what is being negotiated. But again, I think negotiation should also be understood here as an interrogation, because what is being really assessed by Israel and the Americans is the extent to which Hamas is willing to surrender. I'm not saying anything new here. I mean, if you open Fanon's book, for instance, you would understand that, as Fanon says, there's really no negotiation with the colonial condition. That's a problem with it. No, the problem with it is that it already sets up a zero-sum game, that it doesn't allow for any form of negotiation. That's why negotiation basically becomes largely a form of interrogation.
I'll just say for the record, I have opened Fanon's book, unlike some people. So not you, but there's plenty who haven't. Zadie Smith and the but so there's a few different points I want to get to, but one, yeah, I mean, you've laid out this, like, I've seen people using the term perfidy recently, which I had never heard this term before or knew what it meant, but basically it's like, a term for deceitfulness, untrustworthiness, right? It's basically this idea that Palestinians know, and they were talking about it on Electronic Intifada yesterday, that Native Americans in the United States, indigenous people in the United States know it as well, in terms of you get a treaty, right, and it really doesn't mean anything, or you get a ceasefire and it may not mean anything because Israel is always going to violate the terms of this, right? And we could talk about that historically with the Oslo process, with the ceasefire in Lebanon, which Israel continues to violate, right? All of these different examples, and you could talk about it in US history as well. And so this this colonial power, and I think this is one of the contradictions or challenges that I'm struggling with a lot right now, is that if we're looking at ICC, ICJ, as you put it in the piece, there's intensifying accusations of genocide, not merely moral censures, but signs of beginnings of institutional isolation, and so on some level, yes. I mean, I think that there's, we're seeing, I mentioned Zadie Smith a minute ago, partly because I know Steven Salaita did too, but I think you also critiqued one of her pieces very early on in this. Um, but, we're seeing people who were cheerleading essentially for Israel, or certainly condemning, Palestinians early on in this genocide, now coming around and signing letters saying 600 days later, oh, it is actually a genocide and it needs to stop, And so there is an interesting thing happening, I think, culturally on an international level, where you're starting to see some of the liberals who were just fine with this for, I don't know, 550 days, 599 days, I don't know, get to a place where, they're I don't know whether it's just totally cynical and they're worried that their branding will, now be tarnished by being associated with supporting this genocide in some future in which it has been sort of fully enacted, right? Or whether they're, starting to be really grossed out by all of the images coming out and what they have supported in certain ways, right? It's impossible for me to psychoanalyze, or to know all of what contributes to this. But anyways, so you have that happening on kind of, I think, a much larger mass cultural level, where you have more and more people. I saw a Republican congressman today say that there should be an arms embargo with Israel. And this is a low level person. He's not somebody who's like leading the Republican Party. But it was notable to me that he's taking a line that a lot of Democrats in the United States won't take, right? And so you're starting to see some of these, more and more an attrition or an erosion, I guess, of, just this undivided support for Zionism that, we've seen for so long. But I also don't know how much, I don't want to put faith in any of these people or these processes either, right? And I don't think that's what you're doing. I think you're talking more about the people who are strongly committed and dedicated to the cause of Palestine, including Palestinians in the diaspora, but also, other allies and so on, who um, are taking a more, forceful position, who are seeking to exact consequences, who see their efforts as part of some kind of international, kind of popular cradle for resistance or support for the Palestinian cause. Um, but I still struggle with how much, at what point does that matter to Israel? Like, because it seems like the only institutional backer that has mattered to them for quite some time is the United States, and maybe, a little bit of the UK and Germany. I saw Germany waffling on something today, which was interesting. Um, but yeah, so I don't know. That's just what I'm struggling with, is like how many eggs to put in that basket.
Well, I mean, look, I think from our perspective here in Palestine, there's hope in it. Not in Zadie Smith, but hope just generally in the idea that Zionist hegemony, ideological at least, on the minds and hearts of, for instance, American society and culture for that long delay of decades, from the outset of Israel's inception, let's place it in that terms, has become at least more harder to fashion and see unfolding in the future. That American imperial management would need to take, or would need to divide itself between its democratic pretensions at home and also its intricate alliance system abroad, and that will become harder and harder to manage, at least in the future. Of course, having said that, there's a lot of support for Israel, different class positions from different groups of peoples, different religious also doctrines and ideologies that are highly, close to Israel or have some sort of affinity with Israel. But at least there's much more dissensus. There is more disgust. There's politicization happening, and of course, when you see people like Pierce Morgan and others, I mean, who knows why they're taking these positions now? Is it something around also change in government policies in which they're aligned with, and therefore they're also like basically building up some sort of more support for some policies to be taking directed at Israel to try to stop the war? Or is it something around, as you said, fearing backlash from the population around their positions? Or is it some sort of moral awakening that is happening and it's genuine and whatever it is? I'm not sure. Honestly, I really don't care about really speaking to the intentions of people, because what matters is that there is something along those lines where things become harder and harder for the institutions and those that lead them to continue as usual. Business as usual becomes more difficult, much more of a headache. And as Israel continues that war, that gulf just increases, that void between the population and sentiment between. And I'm not here speaking only about people who are very closely aligned with the Palestinian cause, who know very well, but also with the public sentiment at large. Is that why doesn't this stop? Why Israel, which is an ally to the West, quote unquote, for this kind of, let's say, liberal mainstream, is not placed on hold? There's nothing really that Israel is doing at this particular juncture that will actually bring better results, except if it's planning to wipe out every last Gazan in a complete genocide where everybody is killed or injured or left. The totality of Gaza is hit by the missiles that they're throwing at it. So there's that kind of question, and I think. And I've spoken to you about the idea of implosion again, and I think these are symptoms of that. Symptoms of how sometimes institutions are hollowed out slowly, how media operations like the New York Times become less a source of trustworthy news, or, for instance, Palestine. At least how people can see through. The lies, the fabrications, the framings, how this process kind of unfolds. It's not like a very straight on process. I don't want to exaggerate it. I'm not saying that this is going to end the war in Gaza. I never said that. Since the beginning, when people were hopeful, I never said that. But I don't think it's going to be as easy as before. For the backing of Israel, it's not going to be easy to say that I stand with Israel in any major capital in the world. That will not be as easy as before, specifically for a much more wide, diverse audience than some of the elites and the upper classes that, in many cases, have an oversized influence over the states and governance, or they actually control the states and governance. So that's a problem, and it's a problem that will continue to haunt Israel. And whether it will liberate Palestine, it's not perhaps the question here, but it will continue to haunt it. It continue to create problems for it in terms of its legitimacy, in terms of the ability of people to basically, really. Believe what Israelis say. That's another element to it. But having said that, I think a lot of those people that were now crying out that Israel is doing something wrong are easily ready to forgive it as well. So they're like just willing, give us something so we can re-love you again. And so that's why I think some of these positions are momentary, and it could, in many instances, with many writers and many public speakers, could turn into any form of symbolic, performative, redemptive act by Israel, specifically some of its leaders now, like Ehud Olmert and Ehud Barak and others who speak of Israeli war crimes and, like trying to present that type of internal dissenter, ex-leader as a person of consciousness. And again, I see this as part of the problem, because this is also how Israel kind of washes itself through this kind of consciousness, redemptive forms of performativity from ex-leaders who actually practiced massacres and committed them as well, like Ehud Olmert and Ehud Barak. Both of them who are war criminals, no? So like you have that, you have that these redemptive acts coming across, and of course they might have some political calculation around becoming pertinent to some sort of relationship with the West, or with some parts of the various ideological and political currents within the West, and they're trying to position themselves around that. I'm not saying that all of what they're doing and saying is around the performative act of redemption, but I think, again, there's so many people in the mainstream media, and not only still backing Israel, but also when they criticize it, still willing to easily, if you want, forgive it, and come again as proud Israeli supporters at any point, and try to wash it. And you'll see a lot of that, specifically if the war ends.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's part of what I think, one of the questions that I've had throughout this is this question of irreversibility, right? Of like, have actually people seen things that will change them forever, right? And I think for millions of people, I think yes, for sure. But I think there are a lot of people also um who will not, who will be happy to go back to, whatever performative support of Israel is, if, as you say, if there's an end to the war, right? If there's some, at the first opportunity, let's put it that way. And it's hard to know how widespread those different trends are, but I do think that on a popular level, right? So if you're talking about the masses, that I definitely think that um Israel is as unpopular as ever. And I think, that is, I think, true globally, including in the hearts of empire, So shifting gears a little bit, um, I did want to talk about Ilias Rodriguez with you. So this is a person who's alleged, I should always preface that, right, of killing two Israeli embassy, staff people, diplomats of sorts, right? But definitely functionaries, people who, you look at their social media threads, neither of them was born in Israel, right? One's from Germany, one's from the United States, but they both chose to move to Israel. He was an IDF soldier for 3 years and continued to do a lot of pro-Israeli propaganda on social media, including, cheering on war crimes of various kinds, right? And so these two people were killed by Elias Rodriguez a couple weeks ago in DC. And it's been an interesting thing because it's been very divisive, not the act, but the response to the act has really, there's a lot of division in terms of how people have responded to it in the United States. Um, and there's been a lot of socialist and communist, or left-wing organizations, as well as organizations like Jewish Voice for Peace, um and others that rushed to condemn this, that rushed to make a moral public statement of condemnation, um of which there were other alternatives. I mean, one alternative would have been not to speak on it at all, or to also push back against the narrative that was being put forward, that it was an anti-Semitic attack, when the alleged, again, statement, um, you know, is not at all an anti-Semitic statement, and that the statements that we have received from Elias, which have been through state functionaries and stuff like that, so you don't know everything, but have seemed to say that it was anti-Zionist and a pro-Palestine you know expression by him. And so anyways, there's thoughts that I have on this, but I really was interested in also your thoughts on it, because part of, obviously, it's an individual act, right? It's not an act of an organization. At least no organization has claimed any kind of responsibility for it. And but you also have talked a lot about, in the West Bank, that one of the forms of resistance is the so-called lone wolf attacks too, is attacks that take place that are also not necessarily affiliated with any kind of organization, and how the realities of the West Bank sometimes have meant that is the only alternative for a form of you know violent resistance, I guess, or armed struggle resistance, right? um and so I'm curious kind of what your thought was on the reflections and kind of what you've seen about it. I know you're not in the US, so I don't know how, if there's any discussion of it in Palestine and so on.
Well, I mean, probably, I don't think there's a discussion, in Palestine. Like, I wouldn't, not that people are like, trying to, I mean, there are probably some discussions among some certain elite groups, intellectuals, some, whether this is useful or not useful and things like that along those lines. It's generally probably a tactical discussion, not necessarily one that holds a lot of, elements of moralizing or moralistic grounds. But yeah, I don't think it was a controversy here. I think for us and for most Palestinians, looking at this act, seeing that it was also targeted, most Palestinians, didn't really see it outside of the domain of what is, if you want, rational or permissible at this moment. And I think many also Palestinians kind of adopted Elias Rodriguez as, a fidai and a Palestinian fighter in his own right, at least in the public discourses around it, and many of the posters that were also built by Palestinians, including the wide distribution of what is attributed as his kind of final statement before his act, trying to place it on some level of meaning. At least in his own discourse. I'm not sure if it's an authentic document, but this is the one that was translated and was kind of like, distributed heavily among many Palestinians. Interestingly enough, a lot of Palestinians were also pointing out the deficiency of how, this kind of leftist American from Chicago was more willing to give and sacrifice than many of the Arabs in this fight, and also many of the Muslims. So there was that kind of also use, if you want, in public discourse around his actions in relation, if you want, to the Arab paralysis and Muslim paralysis that many Palestinians are lamenting. So that was another element, if you're asking me about kind of the internal discussions here. Look, I'm not sure what's the discussion in the US, but I was surprised by the ways through which many organizations kind of went on fifth gear and condemned the attack. Again, this is not a discussion about violence and nonviolence and its place in the American movement or the Palestine movement more broadly. My position. I've said this quite a lot here, that I am for a wide coalition of various forces that might differ, that might have also in many instances, because I see it operating in a way that could at least help the subject of Palestine in some way. Like, but there's another element to that, which is that Palestine opens the space because institutions are being held, because they're unbelievable, because they are losing their credibility, the legitimacy, their grounding, whether it's media or educational institutions or government or otherwise, because moral claims are being also hauled out. Palestine's opened the space for revolutionary politics, and that's something that I always also spoke of, is that this is something that has opened up now, perhaps in America, for people thinking of some sort of change or radical change, whatever direction they take it, some sort of coalitional politics, or they think of electrical. I'm not sure. I'm not here to prescribe anything in the American scene, but it seemed quite surprising, the idea of this kind of hasty element of condemnation going from statements that have to do with the pro-Palestine solidarity movement, no matter its orientation, whether it's liberal or otherwise, or socialist or otherwise, as if the actions of Elias, or Elias as we say in Arabic, have anything to do with them. Like, why are you condemning something that it didn't emanate from you as a group or an organization or as a political direction? You're quite clear in your politics, which is about civic participation, perhaps civic disobedience at some point, some form of direct action, but not violent, or at least does not go into the violence in terms of hurting another human, if you want to play in that terms. So most of these organizations are already operating within the domain, are already quite clear that that's their own version of politics. So it seemed quite for me problematic, the extent to which these condemnation came fast and highly in succession, and highly orchestrated, as if people are trying to dispel a charge that was not actually placed against them, on the one hand. And the second hand, I think why these condemnations came are not only the fear of police repercussions or the damning of the movement. These are all in play. A lot of these organizations are thinking this might not benefit the movement otherwise. But I do think that also these condemnations came because the horizon of the appearance of this act itself seemed to be a logical a logical appearance, and therefore in need of this condemnation. Why I say a logical appearance? Because of the failure of civic politics, because of the non-listening dimension of the institutions, because of the inability of American government to respond in any significant way to the cries of people, because of the deafness of the Democratic Party and its elites, even in defeat, even when their defeat was, in part at least, the result of the backing of Israel and its genocide in Gaza, that that even after 2 years of massacres, that this kind of targeted operation happened, kind of appeared as logical. And this is, I think, why people panicked in the movement, that kind of at least parts of the movement that have also an element of rejecting this violence out of hand. It panicked because, the theory of change around accountability or screaming in the face of politicians is not operating on the pace that might actually hold or stop the genocide in any significant way. So I think that's the discrepancy. That's the discrepancy. I think that's why I don't think it's only the fear of the backlash, because when also it happened, a lot of people seemed to make it a bigger deal than it was. This is not to say something against the action itself, no. this wasn't like a massacre of people randomly. No, like this wasn't somebody entering a synagogue, God forbid, and like going on and trying to kill anybody he sees, or it wasn't a pure form of hate attack that happened in other contexts, and specifically in American context. I mean, this is a very superficial impression, but from knowing a bit about American society, I mean, it does have the gun culture. It has these kind of episodes of violence. Clinics are bombed every once in a while. These actions are not completely out of place in the American political domain. No. So again, it seems surprising the extent to which you're going on this kind of drive, but I think that it's because of this appearance of the appearance of this act again exposed not only the void but also the non-efficacy of civic disobedience thus far in changing anything. And again, this is not to contradict my earlier statement. I'm saying that a lot of this work, the coalition work, but I think this is how you should read Elias Rodriguez attack. First of all, as a symptom of something, and it's a symptom of a broken system. It's a system. It's a symptom of something that screaming and protesting has not worked. And not only that, we saw the state, its governance, architecture going on the assault and trying to scare people into bowing down through attacks against institutions like the universities, through deportations like Mahmoud Khalil, through the arrest of people who voiced their opinions, through Marco Rubio's right to basically revoke visas for students and incoming visitors to the United States and green card holders. That kind of strategy that also the state went on the offense, and that kind of offensive also, at least from the perspective, I think, of this attack, also is part of the condition of its appearance. Seeing the fear that is also choking the ability of even civic disobedience to emerge, or at least civic protest to emerge in any significant way, because the movement now is in a condition of retreat, rather in a condition of being on the forefront. So these are elements that and this is what I also read in Rodriguez's statement. If it is a statement, I'm not sure. So, correct me if something about the authenticity of
all I know about that is that nobody has issued a denial that it is his statement, and that it went to Ken Klippenstein, who, and not somebody I'm whatever my opinion of him side. There's nothing. No one has contradicted the veracity of his statement as far as I know.
Yeah, this is what is in the statement as well. It's Rodriguez speaking to that, speaking to the void, speaking to the institutional failures, speaking to the need for accountability. He chose one way of accountability. People might digress or have a problem with that way, and that's fine. But again, I don't understand this kind of knee-jerk going into condemnation mode as if you're on the trial or you're being accused. And I think this is you're already conceding a lot of terrain here. In terms of placing yourself as a moral judge on anything. Not only in this element. And and I always say, if you don't have anything really important to say, then maybe you should just shut up and not say anything. I mean, if you're against this because it's tactically wrong, if you think it's morally wrong, you can voice that. There's no problems around that, again. But I think that what Rodriguez atomistic action, if you want, says is that there's a problem and a malfunction that is so severe, and that it crisscrosses these different registers. Not the American government going on the offensive against the Palestine movement, accusing it of anti-Semitism, trying to confine it, and this goes beyond the radical left elements within the movement. It actually goes into even the liberal element of the movement, where they're also placed on this plane of being anti-Semitic, of being anti-American, of being everything that America stands for, and then therefore they're fair game to the American security complex to capture, to deport, to arrest, and to reduce their civic and political rights, whatever rights may exist in the United States at this particular juncture. Creating this kind of zone of uncertainty, making people afraid of speaking out, all are elements of what's going on. And it's when the movement, specifically on the streets, is retreating, people are also seeing daily, kids being killed, burned alive, and that could create the conditions for these actions to really emerge. And the interpretations around them are important because, again, this pathologization, or like we spoke about it when we spoke about also the response of some of the intellectuals on 7th of October, this attempt to create this kind of profane space that eject violence through this act of non-thinking is quite problematic to me, even if you stand against violence in principle, because I think at least you can read these attacks in their own proper sense, at least as symptoms of something malfunctioning and something that reveals something about the conditions under which the movement is now under.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I obviously talked about it a little bit last week with Dr. Lara Shihai. We were both kind of processing it together. I think, you raised earlier the specter of, Israeli business as usual, as well as the ability of people to sleep at night, right? As well as the concepts of exacting a price, right? And I think that, um, these are all, whatever people think about the action, these are all things that come into play. And I mean, in the statement, there is sort of that type of discourse. The statement alleged to be from Ilias, talks about Robert McNamara riding the ferry to Martha's Vineyard, and somebody trying to shove him off because he couldn't stand how smug he was, as this war criminal. And I think, though, the point that you're making is an important one, which is, and I think, I have another conversation, an audio conversation that I don't want to say too much about because it's not out yet. But, one of the things the guest for that said, which is that, like, it says something about the organized left within the United States, that this person didn't feel like they had a place in it where they could channel their you know their energy, their rage, their politics, right, towards a way that they thought could make some kind of impact. And I think exactly what you're saying in terms of this. I mean, there's a moment of retreat in certain ways. There's other spaces in which I see people continuing to, express their bravery, and, and the students, and, small things, but they all add up. Like, I don't want to diminish them. But I think it's a moment where the tactical array that these organizations are comfortable with has been exhausted, and the situation has only gotten worse. So, like you, it wasn't surprising to me. In some ways, it's surprising that we're not seeing more of these kinds of acts to me. It's surprising to me that more countries aren't expelling, Israeli embassies, but there's also this problem, I think, which is that you have large organizations that purport to be the channel of, a socialist horizon, of a revolutionary politics, and they're coming out and, issuing statements, condemning actions like this, and not doing it, as you said, from you talked about the conversation in Palestine and how it's there's some debate around the tactic, or whether it could. And look, I mean, that's, to some extent, I don't love it when people debate tactics of actions that people have taken when the person is in the hands of the state. And that kind of thing. But at the same time, I understand that. I understand that discussion of, tactically, did this make sense? Tactically, will this be bad for the movement? But we're already in a climate of heightened repression where all of us, I think, have some sort of fears. Those of us who have expressed solidarity with Palestine, who are doing something, even as small as like having a podcast of, will they come from me? Will they demonetize this? Will they take away this? And or will you face legal pressure at some point? Could we lose our 501c3 for our organization? Those things are already on the table, and I don't think that it behooves anyone to retreat in this moment. I think it's also a misread of um, the there may be a lot coming out in terms of as these kind of draconian maneuvers here, kidnapping people off the street for doing an op-ed or something like that, right? But those aren't acts that I think come from a position of strength. I think they're acts that come because political Zionism is actually itself in kind of a really dangerous place, and is just sort of lashing out through all of the maneuvers that it can, and so yeah, I mean, to me it was frustrating on multiple levels, but one of them is that I think in many ways, if anyone was hoping that those organizations were the vehicle for them, I think those statements also are a demonstration that for a lot of people it's not, and why it's not, because there's not a there's this moralistic and this kind of self-preservation and this alignment ultimately with what the state and what the Zionists in this instance wanted them to say in response to those attacks. And I think that itself is very problematic for those organizations.
I mean, it is. I mean, I think it is because it also comes at a moment. I mean, look, if they think this is self-protective, if it will help them continue, I don't know. I mean, I can't read the legal layout. If something it was asked from them to do, so they can distance themselves from this action. Again, I'm not here to judge anybody, but the problem I have is that why do you need to condemn when you are not even, in any way, shape, or form advocating for this form of tactical appearance, no, or working towards it, or even, condoning it, or even being an incubator or a genesis for it. So you're quite clear where your politics is. You don't have to be a judge on everything that happens in the world. Otherwise, you'll just spend your time either condemning or condoning. And then you'll have a problem, like, just generally speaking. That's one element of it. But the second element, which I also don't grasp, is already the state. I mean by the state, the American government is on the offensive. So we're not speaking in the zenith of the movement where everybody's on the streets. There's this high influx and flood of peoples and students. No, we're speaking of a moment of retreat, if you want, uncertainty, panic, disorientation, perhaps, in the movement as well. So you have all of these elements coming together, and the state is already on the offensive, already labeling you in these kind of, through the use of lawfare, through the use of cracking down, through, homeland security, through whatever it is that they're using, FBI, etc. at this particular point. So they're already on the offensive, already kind of making very little distinction in the movement as a whole. The political rhetoric coming from the political class is quite also dismissive, viewing the Palestine movement as this kind of internal enemy as those who represent everybody who's an other, everybody who's problematic, these leftists, these immigrants, so conflating the Palestine movement with, I wouldn't say conflating, but placing everybody that Trump doesn't like within the domain of the Palestine movement, and using the Palestine movement, of course, to expand the government's interpretations of the law, and to give it more executive and legal power, just generally and broadly. So you're already under attack. You're already in this kind of position, no? And maybe that's why these condemnations came very fast. That they were this kind of robotic, out of fear. Oh, now they're going to come and get us, and there's kind of sense of panic around it. And maybe that's the explanation for it. Maybe it's because people just have a highly moral, consistent plane where like any act of violence is you're against it. And maybe a lot of organizations have that type of politics, and fine, this is how they define themselves, this is how they operate. But this is the problem. I think it's always more productive to speak of these acts, first of all, outside the intention of the individual himself or herself that tried or did commit such an act, because sometimes that is like a classical way of trying to pathologize again the act as this kind of emanating from some sort of psychic disturbance, some sort of psychological problem, rather than speaking of the structural conditions that made this attack appear logical even in the eyes of Rodriguez himself. And therefore there is a political action here, even if you have a tactical or principled position against these forms of attacks. Then the idea of non-accountability of Israel is quite problematic. And I think, look, part of the political struggle, of course, and perhaps this is where things become more conscious on part of these organizations, is foreclosing the legitimacy of these attacks and delegitimizing them from the outset. So I was giving this kind of, if you want, psychological panicky responses as a domain, but also because I think for a moment when this attack happened, not only people panicked, but it was part of the horizon of thinking, because of the non-responsiveness, deafness of institutions and themselves. And in the manifesto, this is what Rodriguez is pointing to, that a lot of you will understand why I am doing this, no? But I think in beyond that conversation, perhaps because of that, there's this kind of fear that this thing has to be foreclosed and devoid of meaning and condemned outrightly, so it does not encourage any kind of copycats.
Appreciated. There's some good comments in the chat that I'll pull up. And then I don't know, do you have anything else you want to get to?
No, not really. No, can't think of anything, Jared.
All right, well, some comments. Evening all from Antwerp. Welcome back. My favorite analyst, opinionator. Another one favorite guest. Yeah, we probably didn't say this enough. I mean, 600 days plus. I will say this. I mean, Abdaljawad, you were one of the first people that I was talking to early on, had a sense of just how long this actually could be. And I don't know if you thought 600 days, but you sensed the way that Israel would try to use time, and it's obviously something you're still speaking about in your work. Somebody asked this question for you in the Egyptian vision. So this was the Egypt plan you referenced earlier. Wouldn't that require the world's people unseeing what we've seen now, so making that impossible? I think that was with respect to this idea that you could actually sterilize the Palestinian subjectivity or depoliticize. Do you have thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, look, the problem with that is that, it's always possible. It's not completely unrealistic as well that Palestinians themselves renounce their own struggle, like, um, or they're incapable of challenging Israel in any significant way. I mean, one of the problems, again, whether it's, in our discussion around what Elias Rodriguez did, or whether the discussion around October 7th, is that when Palestinians themselves are not willing to really put a lot of obstacles and hurdles and struggle against the Israelis and the Israeli expansionist regime, its ability to entrench itself and build and replace as it seeks the indigenous population of Palestine, is that if the Palestinians are not willing to put on the struggle, I mean, it would be difficult to see how others, seeing or unseeing, is fundamentally important in that relationship. So that is the problem with the idea of neutralization. Now, it doesn't mean, again, that the struggles don't take different forms, shapes, the movement, mutates, mitigates, people find new ways of articulating themselves. This is a moment for the Palestine struggle, not only globally, but also among many people's movements, many, other struggles as well that, connect and echo and listen to each other, and see in Palestine a form of condensation of their own struggle, but also at the same time one that gives them hope that something about the imperial order that we live in can also be changed. There is elements to that will continue in the near future, but the energy comes from here, and yeah, we should be aware of that. I mean, at least in the coming. I mean, the other day I was in a call with a friend or friends, and we had also somebody from Gaza join us. There's a fear that the war will end even within Gaza. Not now. This is a strange thing to say because people want the end of the war. They desire nothing but the end of the war. But the fear is of what happens after the war, in the sense of how will the Palestinian find himself after all? Still morally intact, still feeling a sense of pride, dignity, or having lost what they lost? Because within the domain of war, also people have made choices, have, I don't know, severed relationships, perhaps, acted out of selfishness, acted out of community and sacrifice for others. There's a lot of those stories around, both, if you want, stories that do not attest to the moral and ethical, dimensions of people, and stories that attest to also a lot of people who've, found in their relationship with others a way to actually become more closer and intimate and find some sort of community. There's all of these different stories between, various contexts. So there's also that kind of fear. I mean, this is a psychic fear of what it means for the war to end, and how will people reckon with also how they acted and became within the domain of the war itself. So that's also another dimension. And even that friend I was speaking about also this kind of distance between the people who went to the south in the early days of the war and those who remained in the north, and how they treat food, for instance, or manage with very limited resources, or don't manage with limited resources, and making these kind of distinct identities between those who remained in the north and those who went down south. So there's all of these changes, not only in terms of the destruction of homes, personal spaces within homes, people's livelihoods, people's savings. All of these different things are also being severed from this war, and the impact on the world, on the human, the human story of many people in Gaza is quite severe, because people speak about when somebody speaks of a home being destroyed, I mean, for a lot of Palestinians, like the home is also their personal space, is a space where they feel themselves. They have lost that space, like, and people also mourn their houses. They mourn their, past lives. They mourn this sudden radical change in not only in the domain of uncertainty and the killing zones that Israel has established throughout Gaza and the massacres, but not only the possibility of death that is always on the horizon, but also in this condition of hunger and poverty. But there's a lot of also psychological, if you want, moral, ethical changes. So there's also a problem around, the end of the war and the day after. Not as a day after where, you know, arrangements are made by Egyptians or Israelis, but on how this world war will be, interpreted, given meaning, and how will people continue under it. And again, unless Israel manages to induce that moment of collapse that we were speaking about, that entire moral social collapse and disintegration, we can see some signs of it. We see the rise of gangs and some of the elements that are in cahoots with the Israeli intelligence that are operating. Even today, the Al-Qassam Brigade actually released a video of them, ambushing one of these groups in the Rafah area, and I think killing 4 of them. But in general, there are signs where Israel is making, I would say, limited but still important breakthroughs in penetrating the Gaza community and population in ways that could also encourage Israel to actually continue with the war rather than end it. And the problem with it and the paradox of that is that I also speak of in the piece, because the moment the interrogator, the person who's being interrogated, shows signs of vulnerability and weakness, is also the moment the interrogators actually pounce on him and make it more intense, more difficult, not less intense and less difficult, because they can sense that this kind of breaking, this moment of shattering, if you want, emerging or happening, and it becomes one where signs of weakness or surrendering is a moment that you actually get the worst part of your interrogation at that particular juncture. And and that there are these signs. They're not, if you want, significant enough to create a strategic change at all. But yeah, they're slowly eroding. I don't know how much people are deterred, not deterred, how much there's a rejection of that needs more close analysis. But we've seen also the looting of many of centers where food is distributed, etc. I'm not saying that that's a sign of erosion, because sometimes also these organizations kind of some of the areas where they're stored, or some of the, like the World Food Program or others that have some food stored and distributed, is they haggle these kind of supplies, and people need them. So in conditions of hunger, it's understandable. And also with this kind of American aid company that is backed by Israelis with mercenaries that is being now conducting in Gaza, which I see slowly but assuredly failing. But I think here what is central for people to gather is that also Israel is interested in the trickling down of food, not in famine conditions where people die of hunger in mass. Why? Because, again, what it also seeks is to trickle enough supplies where people fight over supplies. No, because there's equality in famine. No, this is the difference. But if you have a system of distribution of aid that trickles in some food, then that creates problematic internal fighting within the community itself. Because who gets what? How do you get it? How much money does it cost? Is there a class distribution here? who holds it, who can distribute it equally and fairly, who doesn't. And for all their worst sides, these humanitarian organizations, generally speaking, not necessarily in practice always, have this mission of being unbiased and neutral and trying to help everybody. Of course, in many instances, they all, a lot of the foreigners that come and serve in these organizations actually make money of it because they're also mercenaries, but aid mercenaries, no, and humanitarian mercenaries, not all of them, but many of them. And in essence, they also come to make money and sometimes create these kind of black economies where they also benefit and make a lot of money and go out. But there's still at least this element or desire for impartiality and fairness. Humanitarian organization. Israel now is trying to sideline that kind of logic, not only trying through aid to induce people to move from specific areas like the north to south again, but also in many ways trying its best to trickle down food in situations where it will create more internal and social disintegration and moral and ethical collapse between and amongst the people of Gaza. So that's part of the strategic, if you want, layout of how these plans serve Israel in many ways, but it also enables it to try and trickle food, say that they're trying to trickle food without actually giving what Gaza actually needs in terms of the resources, which is much more than what is actually being given at this conjuncture.
Yeah, and we're saying, as usual, that this is a war crime. I mean, that also using starvation as a weapon of war and using, aid as I mean, these are also violations of international law. Somebody also brought up that genocide is against international law and is the highest legal precedent at play. They were saying this in context of Elias Rodriguez's actions, which I think is an important thing to center. And I did actually want to ask you about that a little bit because I don't want to put you on the spot with this question, but I feel like earlier on, or at some point, you felt genocide was a bit of a metaphor to some. I mean, you say something along these lines in the piece of it's, genocide is not a metaphor at this point. Like it's, it's a reality. And I guess maybe it was a question of whether it was the right narrative for the Palestine solidarity movement at some point to use that rhetoric. I know you've had your own critiques of, for instance, the Nakba, as just even how that kind of sits within Palestinian, consciousness and whatnot. But I don't know if you have anything you want to say about that, or if I'm just putting words in your mouth.
No, I mean, I wasn't saying genocide is a metaphor. I take it literally that, I mean, look, I always said if settler colonialism is about the elimination of the native, then it's a genocide from the outset, and the problem with the discourse in Palestine around genocide is not like the problem of discourse of genocide in the, let's say, more Western intellectual and political and media scene. Because in our context, it's more, the insistence among many Palestinian, I would say, right-wing pragmatic intellectuals to place Palestinians as only, as receivers of Israeli action. So the genocide as a discourse here politically appeared in a way that it was politicized, not in a way that was trying to treat it as a legal or philosophical or whatever, or political category describing the singularity of what's occurring in Gaza in a way that renders it intelligible to people. Now, of course, it's good to make it, because a lot of the people who are insisting on the word genocide in political discussions here were also people that are asking Hamas to give up. Incidentally, and the logic goes like that. This is no war. You don't have anything to face Israel with. eventually you have to give up. And maybe if you give up, then this genocide will stop, which belies the logic of genocide. No, like it sounds quite actually horrendously illogical. If this is a genocide, then the only way to get away from genocide is it, if you have even a chance of doing that, is to actually fight back or make it costly for the other side that they stop willing it and creating the conditions for it and continue with it. And maybe you won't be successful even if you resist, but at least that gives you a better chance. But that was a discussion here. So the problem with it is that they wanted to by insisting on the word ibadah and genocide, they were doing that. There was another type of intellectuals who wanted to import it as a way to speak of the Palestinian experience contemporarily as one that echoes other experiences like the Armenian genocide and the Holocaust and others across the history of Namibia, whatever it is, across the history of colonialism and European genocide, in this kind of intellectual, refined sense of now we're the new absolute victims, and we need to speak of ourselves as such, and we have this kind of intellectual responsibility to speak to our own dismemberment and destruction and collapse and catastrophe in these ways. And to me, all that sounds, whatever, people can do that. And then therefore you have to articulate kind of this as a frontier of political engagement, specifically in international legal institutions and across world opinion. And to some degree, that's where it becomes more convincing, because it is what Israel desires, the end of the Palestinians. This is what they're making clear. This is what they're acting in their practices. But at the same time, it doesn't take away from the will to undo it. So therefore, when we say genocide, it doesn't mean that there's still no will among the Palestinians to fight back, to reclaim what their land, their freedom, to fight for liberty, and to still act for something that is more proactive than just stopping the genocide, which is, the one that we're arguing with, because that makes the Egyptian proposal now appear as the most reasonable instead of a third way or something else that we should think about. How we mobilize this moment to create the conditions, at least, for a long-term sustainment of the Palestine movement as a movement that both interacts and intersects with other movements, but at the same time, also one that would take an eye of concern and love and solidarity and backing of the Palestinian people, ensuring that they have, many allies across the world that will serve and help with their cause in terms of opinion making, in terms of validation, I wouldn't say validation, but in terms of, amplifying, in terms of, whatever it is that people feel that they can do and help with this movement, but also the Palestine movement and Palestine as a symbol of everything that is wrong with societies like the American society, the hollowness of the institution, the non-responsiveness, the type of politics that people live under. And again, these are moments that are clarifying for everybody who's willing to look and see and listen and, have a real understanding of the world, as we say, because this is a moment where you see, how the violence of colonialism and imperialism still exists, how old liberal fantasies of a liberal world order is just that, a fantasy, how Palestine is able to disrupt all these kind of self-delusion ploys and discourses in a ways that, even if you know them theoretically, become much more clear, visceral, and close to peoples across the globe. And therefore, I think also opens up politically the potential for movements willing to think of alternative modes of relating to the world and politics to think of them. So that's the other element of Palestine that I think it gives and bequeaths to the world. So it's not only about us being saved through this kind of lens of an asymmetric relationship where, people in the imperial core give us support, and therefore we're free. This kind of simplistic model of how sometimes people think of politics and how it changed, or how real radical change can happen and unfold in the world. But also in the hope, which is the real hope that I have, which is that Palestine opens up political potentials elsewhere. It's like, if you want it's not a butterfly effect, but much more or bigger than a butterfly effect, if you want to take it, because it is thick and condensed and has all these ideological, political, and material entanglements that make it not out of interest in Palestinians, of course, because as you can see, even most of the intellectual discourse in the West, even when it's making distance with Zionism, or it's mourning Zionism, mourning an ideal of Zionism, it's elegies to Zionism. Many of the books written, many of the works being celebrated are around that theme as well. And I think that this is why Palestine opens up something not only for Palestinians per se, but of course it's important that still Palestinians find a light at the end of the tunnel that is not a train coming to hit us. So that's the other element. Yeah, I spoke a lot, so.
No, that was great. I appreciate it. Some other comments from the chat. Great to see folks from around the world tuning in. Hi from South America. This person's from Uruguay. Thanks for tuning in. Know very well U.S. imperialism, fascism, and how they operate. And the comment about the PR, losing the PR, this was in respect to, Zionism and the Israeli position in the world. This is CYA, for people who don't know, is cover your ass. That's what Zadie Smith and others are doing. And this, I think, was a really important point. I mean, it's not obviously that these organizations haven't been condemning the mass slaughter of Palestinians. They have, but even in a statement which could, and I'm not advocating this, to be clear, but even in a statement that could say, we don't support this action, it still could at least raise the contradiction that the bigger issue is that, today 125 Palestinians were killed, or whatever, or, however tens of thousands the current estimates are. I think 60,000 or so at this point is the kind of low end estimate that everybody knows is an undercount in Gaza, and so, why focus on a couple of deaths in face of that? And I think this, yes, and to me, the condemnations indicate that these organizations have no genuine desire for revolutionary politics. Cowering under threats of the state doesn't accomplish anything. Yeah, it's disheartening. Anyway, I don't want to leave folks on that negative note, because I do think that, as you said, certainly, I do like this idea of Palestinians bequeathing a kind of revolutionary, potential to the world. The big problem is whether the world is worthy of such a gift, and whether the world is going to, do anything to also defend Palestinians, in this moment. And I think that that's so far, I would say, unfortunately, my feeling is that we're not, don't feel very worthy right now. I think that the difficulty is that it has also, if it has exposed the possibility, but it's also exposed, I think, a lot of people who maybe thought that that those revolutionary possibilities were there, and have seen how inadequate they are in the face of this genocide. And I hope that people can find their grounding and their footing to keep up the war of attrition against this project in kind of any way that they can. I don't know if you have any final things to say, but I always appreciate being in conversation with you and appreciated the piece. And I'm sure you'll have more coming soon because you always do have something that's in the wings waiting to be published somewhere.
I mean, I've been honestly struggling with writing recently, just generally. But yeah, I mean, look, I'll end with this. I mean, I think that what is, you know, nobody's worthy of anything or unworthy of anything, Jared, to push against your. And it's fine that we feel a sense of, you know, being complicit, being feeling sense of guilt, feeling perhaps a sense of shame, feeling a sense of feeling inadequate, feeling, these are all, feelings that could be productive. But as the Palestinian, resistant tradition teaches us, when you're unsure, act. And here, always action kind of brings out new elements, new formations, new potentialities. And yes, I do agree with you that maybe Palestine opens up also the potential for hardened fascists to come to the fore, not only leftists. Unfortunately, because it also, this hollowing out, this distance from institutions, from the order as such, if leftists and people who have a vision of the world that is built more on social justice and the creation of a different order than the capitalist system that we live under, are not organized enough, other people will fill the vacuum and fill the void. So I think the potential is there. I think the question is who really takes it up, or
Yeah, socialism or barbarism, right? Like that is kind of the question that it puts on the table.
yeah.
Um, well, again, really appreciate talking with you, and I'm sure we'll have you on again soon, and we can continue our conversation. Um, so thank you.